Hello, hello, everyone. We're starting to see folks come into the webinar. Welcome. I am Jessica. I work at Magoosh, and we are so excited to talk about SAT, ACT study timelines, be they short or long, but really focusing in on how to get the most out of a short timeline if you have one. As folks are coming in. Yes, I see a question from Giannis. This session will be recorded and we're happy to follow up with you via email. Also, if you join our Facebook group, which is called Acing the ACT, SAT, Everything Parents Need to Know, it will be posted there as well. So yes, it will be recorded. Thank you. And I'm going to actually set a poll live. We'd like to just learn a little bit more about who is here. So I'm going to launch the poll. There are two questions there. What year is your child graduating? So do you have a rising senior, someone who is graduating and maybe retaking? Okay, I'm seeing answers coming in. And then where are you based? And I know, so Zoom only allows this many answers for the polls. If your place of residence is not listed, please let us know. Yes, we can email the recording to everybody on the email list. Thanks for that question, Tanisha. Okay. Let's see, we have lots of rising seniors and juniors and a couple younger children as well. And looks like most folks are dialing in from the US. Got some strong showing from the Midwest and the South. Welcome, welcome. Hopefully we are not interrupting your dinner time too much, but it's a webinar, so feel free to eat. All right, well, as we are finishing up this poll, I would like to introduce our featured speaker today, who is Erika Tyler-John. She works at Magoosh as well and is our test prep expert, well, one of our test prep experts for SAT and ACT. She's been doing this work for years and years, has worked with many, many students on improving their score. So I am so excited that we get to chat with all of you today, and I will hand it off to Erika.
Thanks, Jessica. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here for our How to Get the Most Out of a Short SAT ACT Study Timeline webinar. If you haven't been to one of these before, we do these every so often on our Facebook page, primarily on Zoom, but we talk about it on our Facebook page. So join up if you'd like to. And as you might have joined from email, we send out information about that as well. These are recorded. We tend to post them on our Facebook, on our YouTube. So if you aren't able to stay the whole time, you'll still be able to benefit. But I will be answering questions at the end after we get through our material. So if you want to get answers about Magoosh, about your specific situation, your child's specific situation, test prep advice, I can take a stab at admissions advice. Please do stick around. Okay, we'll go ahead and jump in. So quickly, again, I'm Erika. I am the SAT ACT Senior Curriculum Manager at Magoosh, which means that I'm responsible for a lot of the strategy for our content. So deciding which lessons, which questions are going to be most useful for your student, what order to present them in, how best to present them. It also means that I design the curriculum for our live classes. We've got some of those starting next week. So that's pretty exciting for both SAT and ACT. Now, over the years, I've written and taught materials for more than 10 different standardized tests. So this is kind of my life, but SAT and ACT are the ones that I started with. They're the ones that I keep coming back to. So they're really near and dear to my heart. I live in Seattle, Washington, where it is currently very gray. It was really lovely, but it has past us for a little while. And I live here with my husband and my 2 cats. Okay, one other thing that I want to mention is that we have a exclusive discount coupon code for this webinar. It is webinar 060621, which is today's date to make that easier to remember. It is for 10% off any ACT or SAT plan. So that's our online program. That's also our live classes. Again, some of which start next week, but we also have them in July and August. So this is available if you would like to use it. I'll pop it back up at the end, but 10% off coupon. So our goals for today's webinar, I want to walk through study plans for a couple of different timelines. So I want to walk through a timeline for 1 week until test day. So that'll be a particularly good timeline if, say, you are taking the SAT next weekend, or your child is taking the ACT next weekend. I also want to talk about 1 month until test day. So that might be relevant for you if your child is taking the ACT next month, so in July. And I want to talk about 2 to 3 months until test day. So that's if you are taking the early September ACT or the late August SAT. Now, all of these, of course, are still relevant if your child will be taking the ACT or SAT later, but you're just not ready to start studying quite yet. These plans will all be useful for you. And then we're going to talk about night before and morning of routines that can just set you or your child up for best success on their test day. And this is going to be applicable no matter what your study timeline is. Okay. So we'll go ahead and jump in with 1 week until test day. And I'm just going to ask in the chat if anyone has a test day that is next weekend, or I guess this weekend. So the ACT that's coming up, let me know in the chat, just so I know how many folks here are in this situation. So if you are 1 week out from test day, this is probably a situation, okay, yeah, we got at least one. Okay, a couple, 3, okay, it looks like there are 2, wow. Okay, so there are several people who are 1 week out. So at this point, there's probably not a ton of extensive learning that's gonna get done at this point, which probably you're all aware of. I just want to reiterate that. But that doesn't mean that there isn't stuff that your child can do to improve their score, improve their chances of success, of consistency on test day. So this last week before test day is going to be less focused on content and on learning new things and more on solidifying strategy and addressing mistakes. So the first thing that I'm going to recommend is to take a full-length practice test ASAP. And by ASAP, I mean like today or tomorrow, if your child has not already taken one this weekend. And the reason for that is that it's usually a good idea, no matter what your timeline is, to do a final practice test about a week out. Now, there's a couple of pieces to this. We don't want it to be so much before that, that you're not really getting all the mileage out of it. Maybe you've learned a bunch of stuff, but you haven't applied it in a practice test context. Not ideal. We also don't want to push that practice test too close to test day for a couple of reasons. One, because it's not going to give you any time to review that practice test and to learn anything from it, to take something away that you can take into test day. But 2, because a practice test is a lot of work, right? It is a ton of energy, especially if you're going in and doing the kind of review that you should do to take something away from it. So it's 4 hours for the test and then probably another 4 hours for review. That's 8 hours. That's a ton of energy. And if you're trying to do that in a couple of days before your test, that's taking a lot of energy away from what could be going toward that test. Oftentimes when I see students doing that, they end up tired on test day or not at their best and don't perform as well as they'd like to. We want to make sure that they're able to recover and be feeling good going into their test day. So highly recommend a final practice test the weekend before test day. So if that's already happened, amazing. I've got more to talk about how you can get more out of it. If not, I would recommend trying to get that done today or tomorrow. So final practice test, full length, timed, all in one sitting, realistic as possible. Now, part of the benefit of that is to have the experience that you're going to have on test day. So to just kind of like mentally and emotionally prepare, make sure you're feeling comfortable with the timing, make sure you're feeling comfortable with the testing anxiety, that you're feeling good about the endurance, all of that good stuff. So it's almost like a practice run, a dress rehearsal. But the second part of that is that, like I mentioned, you can review your mistakes. And that's going to be really, really beneficial because it's going to help your child figure out, okay, what am I successful on? What am I not really worried about going into test day? And what am I making mistakes on? You know, either still making mistakes on, or maybe I haven't done a bunch of studies, so I'm just learning that these are things I'm making mistakes on. Maybe I'm struggling with timing on a particular section. Maybe there's a particular question type I'm struggling with. Maybe there's a wrong answer trap I'm dealing with. Maybe there's something in my process that's just a little awry. But we're going to figure that out, going in with each mistake, going, okay, what did I do? Why did I do that? And how can I address that in a future problem? Now, the reason that we do this is because it's going to allow us to make a really personal strategy guide. Now, I really want to highlight the word personal there because I always recommend a strategy guide to all of my students as a really valuable thing to do in the last week before test day. But I find that when a lot of people hear strategy guide, what they do is they go online and they look up SAT or ACT strategies and they write down a bunch of strategies that they've never used and that wouldn't be particularly useful for them, that they don't even plan on using on test day, and that don't get at their specific weaknesses, at their specific struggles, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to go, okay, I'm going to make this super personal based on my final practice test. I'm going to go, okay, where was I making mistakes? Okay, what did I do there? Why did I do that? And then how can I recognize the same thing in a future problem and then address it? All right. So we're going to go, okay, what am I going to recognize? And this could be something like, I'm actually going to kind of skip ahead here. I'm often going to do this in a prompt response format. And that's what I recommend to my students is to go, okay, how do I recognize that same thing coming up? And then how do I respond to it? So it's almost like the clue and then the action. So an example, when I see exponents, I'm going to reduce the bases to primes. But it can also be less content specific. It can be like when I am running behind, I'm going to start skipping questions that look particularly challenging and that I don't feel confident on. Or it could be something like when I see a reading question, I'm going to make a prediction before I look at the answer choices, or blah, 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 right? So it's going to be personal to the sorts of mistakes that your student is making, and it's going to be as actionable as possible. So just having the response or the strategy isn't going to be useful if we don't have that prompt, that clue for when to use it. Let me know if you have any questions on that concept. I'm happy to talk about it more, but I find that this is game changing, and it isn't a way that a lot of students are thinking about this because it's really hard to think about it like this. It takes a lot of energy. I typically find that for effective practice test review, you're spending as much time on review as you're spending on the test itself. So like 4 hours of review, which is a lot, but it has huge benefits because now you have this amazing strategy guide that you now know when to apply, and that can actually really, really help with your specific mistakes. So backing up for a second to that first bullet, I recommend that when you're making a strategy guide, you do a general strategy section. So that's going to be test-wide stuff about maybe time management, anxiety management, endurance, pacing, that's the same thing as time management, things like that. And then broken out by section. So what are the strategies I have for reading on either test? What are the strategies I have for math on either test? Maybe what are the strategies I have specific to calculator or no calculator on SAT? What are the strategies I have for SAT writing or ACT English? What are the strategies I have for ACT science, and then potentially essay? So we're going to break that out by section, and we're going to really spend time making sure that we come up with strategies we know that we can apply and that are going to be personal. All right, so once we have that good to go, we're feeling confident that we're hitting the big points here. And I'll come back to that question toward the end, just because it's maybe not super relevant to what we're talking about here, but that is a great question. I'll come back to that at the end. So what we're going to do is we're going to review that strategy guide daily. Right? So we're probably at this point, once we've done the test, we don't want to do the review the same day. That's too much work in one day. Your quality is going to drop. We probably want to do that review in like the 2 days following, just to kind of space it out, make sure that the quality is really, really high there. So we're probably like 3 or 4 days out from test day at this point. So we're going to use those 3 or 4 days to review that strategy guide, really make sure that those strategies are front of mind when we're going into test day. And then we're going to do light practice to reinforce that strategy. And I really just want to lean on that point of not to cram. So I find that a lot of students, especially if they feel that they haven't studied enough going into their test day, they try to overcompensate in that last week by doing as many problems as possible. And kind of like taking a practice test right before your exam, that takes a lot of energy. It can lead to burnout, and it can actually lead to making mistakes over and over again because we're trying to prioritize quantity over quality. And that can actually lead to bad habits and can actually make your score worse and your performance worse on test day. So reduce the number of problems, keep it small, but keep it focused on implementing those strategies effectively. And if you find you're still making mistakes, go, okay, how do I adjust my strategies to make sure they actually work for me come test day? Cool. So that's 1 week until test day. And again, we'll talk about the night before and the morning of toward the end of this portion. But this last week is going to be focused on strategy. And that's all going to be based around one really high value practice test the weekend before. Okay, so that's 1 week until test day. Let's go ahead and talk about 1 month until test day. So if anybody is taking the July ACT, shout that out in the chat. Got at least one. Okay, I'm seeing some raised hands. Yeah, I'm seeing a couple. Okay, awesome. Yeah, okay, great. So several folks on the July SAT. July ACT. So when you have 1 month until test day, that's a little bit more, right? So you've got, okay, I'm seeing a bunch of folks on July. Awesome. It's a great time to take the test in the summer, get it done, get it over with, especially if your child's going into senior year, so they don't have to worry about it. So if you've got 1 month until your test day, again, it's a tight timeline, but you have a little bit more time to potentially go beyond strategy, right? And get a little more into content. And when you are dealing with strategies, to have time to practice it, really build habits that you'll be more sure will actually come to the table on test day because you've had time with them. So once again, we're going to take a full-length practice test. It's the same thing. So all of these timelines start with a full-length practice test. But the reason that we take this full-length practice test is going to be slightly different for a 1 month timeline. So we're still going to take that practice test. We're still going to do an in-depth review over the next couple of days. But while we can start a strategy guide now, and that's actually really useful to kind of build a strategy guide from the jump and correct it throughout, the bigger thing that we're going to do here is we're going to create a study plan to target weaknesses. So rather than going, okay, here's what I'm struggling with, let me turn that into a strategy for me to implement right away on my test day, we're going, okay, based on my weaknesses, I'm going to figure out what I need to study so I can build that habit up so that I know I'm going to be able to implement it on test day, that I know that strategy and can practice that strategy more going into test day. So we're going to create that study plan to target weaknesses. So maybe I noticed from my test, I'm really struggling with timing on reading passages. I know that I'm making careless mistakes in math. I'm just not answering the right question. Okay, cool. So that's something I need to practice. I know that I'm struggling with sentence ordering in either English or writing. And maybe I really struggle with anything that has to do with percents. I often answer like percent of instead of percent change, or I take the percent of the wrong thing when it's math or science. All right. And there's probably more things than that, but let's say that those are several of the things. What I'm going to do is then I'm going to go, okay, I'm going to plan leading up to my next practice test to study those things. And then I'm going to set aside when I'm going to study for each of those things, what I'm going to study for each of those things, and make sure that I know what I'm doing. So I'm not just doing random practice in the hopes that it improves for me. So block off time on the calendar. And if you were here for our last webinar, this is not unfamiliar because this was one of my big points on how to balance test prep with a busy schedule. And one of the biggest things is to put it on the calendar, because when you have so many other priorities, which when you're in high school, you do, right? There's school, there's your extracurriculars, there's your social calendar, there's all of the things that you're doing to get into college and just to continue living your life. So there's a lot of priorities going on. And if we don't prioritize our study, it's going to fall through the cracks. I've seen it happen a million times, and I've seen it happen to me. So put it on the calendar, prioritize it, plan when those things are going to happen to make it easier to actually execute on that study plan. Now, I kind of hinted at this, but we're going to take full-length practice tests more than once because we have the time. So the timeline that I recommend for practice tests is every 2 weeks approximately. If you've got a longer timeline, you can spread that out to like every 4 weeks, just to make the practice tests stretch longer. But if your timeline's that short, you can do them more frequently. So I recommend every 2 weeks on the practice tests, and that's going to give you just the perfect amount of time between practice tests to make sure that you actually learn something, that you are taking something of value into your next practice test and can improve in that next practice test. If you're going much shorter, say every week or even a couple of days, you're not giving yourself a lot of opportunity to improve between those tests, and you're pretty unlikely to see a score improvement between them. But also, again, these practice tests take a lot of energy, especially if you're doing all of that mistake review, and especially if you've got school going on at the same time and a bunch of other stuff. It's just going to be really, really hard to maintain that balance in your life and to not get in a situation where you're performing worse artificially. If you're in the summer and you've got very little else going on, you could potentially do every week, but it would have to be a situation where you're very confident that you're getting in study like every day in between it, but like with a day off and enough time to rest and recover between them. But I would not recommend any more frequently than that. Okay, so we're going to take a full-length practice test about every 2 weeks. And then as we do that review, we're going to use the mistakes to adjust your study plan. So maybe you found that something that was an issue in your first practice test, you really addressed during your study. You figured it out. You've got a whole new strategy. You nailed it on this practice test. Awesome. Maybe we'll do a little bit of practice on that to just solidify it, make sure it's really rock solid over the next couple of weeks. But probably not going to be super prioritized. Maybe there's something that wasn't an issue on the last one, but was here. Okay, that maybe indicates that my strategy is inconsistent and I want to make it consistent before test day. So that's going to be a priority for me. And then maybe something that I was working on did not improve for this test. Okay, so that's maybe an indicator my strategy was not good or that I just wasn't implementing it right. So I'm going to really focus on that one to make sure I'm not building a bad habit and that I can address it before test day. Cool. So we're going to use these practice tests in kind of the same way as the first one, but instead of building that study plan from scratch, just to adjust it to make sure that, again, at every moment in the study timeline, we're getting the most benefit, the most personalized benefit out of our study. And then once again, we want to make sure that that final practice test is about a week out. So I recommend just kind of sitting down and going, okay, if my test date is here, here's where my last practice test should be. Count back 2 weeks from that, put that on the calendar, count back 2 weeks from that, put that on the calendar for as much time as you have. Okay. Now a little bit more on 1 month until test day. When you get to the week before your exam, so you've just taken your final practice test, you will have the exact same final week study plan as your 1 week timeline. Now, you might have already started to build your study guide or your strategy guide, in which case, awesome. You're just going to want to be refining that, making sure that it's really specific to where you're at right now, that the strategies are actually the strategies you're using, that strategies that you don't need to be on there aren't on there, that strategies that you do need to be on there are on there. But the other benefit here is that you don't just have that last practice test, but you have multiple practice tests. You have all of that study in between your practice tests to base your strategy guide off of. So that's just going to lead to a better, more complete, more realistic strategy guide. When you've got a week out, a lot of your strategy guide is hope. It's going, okay, I didn't do this, but here's what I can do. And then you do your best to implement it over that week. With a month, you've had a chance to actually try these things out, see if they work. So it's got a higher likelihood of actually being successful. That doesn't mean that you don't need to do this step though. This step is so important and reviewing it is so important just to make sure that it is really front of mind when you're going into test day. I find that a lot of students, their strategies fly out the window when they go into a test situation. We want to make sure that that's not the case. That's part of why we do practice tests, but it's also part of why we really drill in strategy in the last week to make sure that it actually does come with us in that stressful environment. And then the last piece is, again, we're not going to cram. It's not effective, but it also can be damaging to mental and emotional health going into that test. And that's a really, really big component of this test. So we're going to make sure in that week that we are feeling good and prepared internally to take that exam, that we're feeling confident and that we're ready to go. All right, so that's 1 month until test day. But what if you got a little bit more time? What if you're looking at 2 to 3 months until test day? Or maybe you've got test day coming up right now, but you know that you're doing a retake later. So in the chat or raise your hand or whatever, if you are planning for the September ACT or the late August SAT, let me know. Okay, I'm seeing several folks in that boat. Again, great time to take it, either at the end of the summer, beginning of the school year, really great. Get it done before the school year. So 2 to 3 months until test day. This is the last timeline that I would actually consider to be a shorter timeline. And frankly, it's like branching into medium length timeline. Any longer than that, and I would say like you've got a really solid chunk of time. You're really working with a lot here. 2 to 3 months is definitely going to be more time than 1 month. It opens up more opportunities, but it is still going to be an amount of time where you're probably not going to be able to cover everything on the exam in extreme detail. So you're still gonna want to do prioritization, but at the same time, it is enough time to build some really nasty habits. So we're gonna want to make sure that our study is good so that it's not actually hurting us. So it's exactly the same as 1 month, just longer. So one of the options here, and one of the options that I really recommend if your child is self-studying, is to just do the same thing. Or if you're doing something that is maybe maybe a little more guided at the beginning and then going into self-study, we're going to use these exact same principles, because no matter how long your timeline is, you're going to want to make sure that your study is customized and personalized, and that you're getting the most out of it, and that you're not building bad habits. So it's going to be a very, very similar thing. You're going to do that same cycle: practice, test, review, prioritize your study, repeat. Practice, test, review, prioritize your study, repeat. But you're going to get more rounds of that, which again is going to build up confidence with those strategies, make them really, really strong. It's also going to give opportunities to dig more into more issues and give more time for those issues to surface. So for instance, if I were on the math section and I knew that I really struggled with, let's see, triangles, and I knew that I really struggled with complex numbers. Triangles are going to show up way more than complex numbers, so I'm going to spend my time on triangles if I've got a shorter study timeline. If I've got a longer study timeline, I'm still going to start with triangles, but it also gives me an opportunity maybe later, once those triangles are solid, to get into kind of the weirder stuff, the stuff that's not going to show up as frequently, like complex numbers, which can get me a couple extra points and potentially push me into a higher range of scores. So we get more rounds to personalize, and that just gives us more opportunity to dig in deep and just strengthen. So a really good goal with this timeline, because again, this timeline builds opportunities, or sorry, gives opportunities to build bad habits, because it's plenty of time to build habits, whether they're good or bad. A goal here is to never make the same mistake twice. And that's just going to help make sure that this study doesn't become rote, that it doesn't just become random drilling, and that it is still targeted at strategy and that we're getting the most out of it. So I want to make sure that you or your student are studying as little as possible, but getting as much out of that study as possible. Now, that said, I kind of mentioned earlier that you may not want to do that self-study loop the whole time. And when you've got a longer timeline, it does open up opportunities to do something that's going to be a little bit more comprehensive. So maybe something like a book or a course, like the live classes at Magoosh, where it's going to cover 95% of what's on the exam. Now, that's not going to be as 100% targeted to your students' personal weaknesses, but what it's going to do is it's going to give information about what those weaknesses could be, right? So if your student is starting from maybe a point where they're struggling to do their study consistently, or they don't really know what's on the exam, or maybe they're struggling across the sections. Something like that will be a good way to just kind of get introduced to what's going on there, and then to learn, okay, this chapter or this lesson, great, learned a lot, I'm feeling really awesome. This one, maybe I need to come back. So then with our remaining month or two, we can go, let me dig into those things that surfaced as issues during that more comprehensive study. Now, this is also something that you can do if you have a 1 month timeline. So for instance, our live classes are targeted to be 4 weeks. So if you do have a month until your test day, you can take that 1 month course. So for instance, if you were taking the July ACT, you could take that 1 month July ACT course. That's something that I would really recommend for your students, again, if they're struggling with consistency on study or they need help kind of across the sections. But if you're going to be self-studying, I would recommend just trying to cater it. But it's really something that I recommend for a longer timeline. So comprehensive, then catered. All right. So that is the 2 to 3 month until test day timeline. Now, if you've got a longer timeline than this version is probably just something that you will expand and stretch. I would really recommend, if you do have that longer timeline, to maybe do something more comprehensive first, and then to move into that something more targeted. So that second option there. I don't know if anyone is in that boat. Let me know if you are going, I don't know when my student's going to take that test, or maybe they're going to be taking it in late September or October or further into the future. Let me know in the chat. If you're in that case, you just have more options, but you're really going to want to focus on never making that same mistake twice, not falling into the trap of just studying to study. All right. So regardless of timeline, you're going to want to have a night before routine that just sets your child up for success. So the night before test day, I recommend reviewing your strategy guide, just like you've been doing those previous nights, but I don't recommend practicing. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One, it wouldn't be the end of the world if you did like 5 problems. But it's hard to sit down and just do 5 problems. I find that a lot of students do like a whole section before their test day, or they do like 10 problems from each section. And then that just ends up being like hours of study. And if we're doing problems before test day, it can actually be kind of discouraging if you're making mistakes on them, and it can just put you in kind of a bad place before test day. So I don't recommend doing it. Just review the strategy guide. Don't practice. That's been happening the previous nights. Now, one thing that I do recommend doing the night before is visualizing success. And this sounds hokey, but I want to talk about what I mean when I say visualize success. So I don't mean picture yourself getting into your dream school and walking on the campus and then graduating cap and gown and getting that incredible job at the dream company. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about success on test day and literally what the actions on test day look like that lead to that success. So that's going to be imagining things like, okay, I'm behind time, so I'm skipping problems, and that helps me get back on track. And then I get through the section with enough time to go back and revisit those problems and at least make a guess. Or now I have fresh eyes and I'm going to be able to solve the problem in a way that I wouldn't have before. Or I look at a science passage and it's full of words and concepts that I don't understand, and it makes me nervous, but then I remember that I don't have to know what it means. I have to look at the relationships. So I really do a little bit of the text, but I focus on the trends and the diagrams. And then I have complete success with the questions because it doesn't really matter what it was about. It matters the relationships. Okay, great. Or so on and so forth, right? So I'm going to imagine using strategies from my strategy guide on test day to success. So that's actually something that can be really, really helpful for a couple of reasons. One, because it can help reduce really like unproductive, anxious thinking. A lot of students end up kind of like very stressed going into test day, and that's totally normal and relatable. I find that it's helpful to think about, okay, what are those things that you're nervous about? Okay, if that happens, what do I do? And then if we're able to come up with a solution to that, it can make that thinking more productive. It can really ease that stress of going, okay, I know what to do in that situation. Recording will be sent out after this ends. And I saw a couple other questions come in. I'll answer those at the end. So imagining that can help deal with those unproductive thoughts and help your student feel calmer, but it can also help reduce the barrier to entry on actually doing those things on test day. Like I mentioned, oftentimes strategy can fly out the window on test day because it's a new environment. We try to create as much of a similar environment in our practice tests as possible, but we don't always get it right. It's just different. It's just a different feeling. imagining that and imagining that in a test day setting can just help our brains make those connections a little bit early and make it easier to do that on test day itself. So that's just going to make it less likely that the strategies leave and that they actually happen because we've imagined doing it. The night before, I also really recommend taking care of tasks that are often morning tasks because we want to make the morning as easy as possible. We don't want to be late. We don't want to be stressed. We want that to be calm and easy. So things that I recommend here: pack your materials. So your IDs, your allowed calculator, your pencils, your erasers, your sharpener, any snacks that you're gonna bring for test day, your outfit. Plan to wear layers in case it's hot or cold, but just plan that in advance. Your directions to your testing center, your exact timeline for the morning. Do as much of that in advance as possible so you're not thinking about it in the morning. And the last thing is relax and go to bed. I really do not recommend cramming in any way the night before. That can just be a tough night. So I recommend doing something that you or your child feels relaxing. So maybe that's playing a little bit of video games. Maybe that's watching a little bit of TV. Maybe that's reading a book. Maybe that's doing yoga. Maybe that's going for a walk with a friend, whatever, something that is relaxing and that is going to help you feel good going into sleeping that evening. And then go to bed. Make sure that you're going to get enough sleep before your test day so that you're feeling rested and alert and that your brain is working at its highest functioning. All right, morning of. It's time. Get up early enough to not run late. I see two approaches that are pretty bad to the morning of test day. Approach number one is waking up so early because you're stressed that you're going to be late and you want to make sure everything gets done. And then you just end up with like 2 hours to kill before your test. And you sacrificed on sleep and just spent more time wheel spinning. Don't do that. Have a plan again from the day before. Give yourself enough time, but not too much. The other thing that I see is folks rolling out of bed and rolling out the door. They've planned as much in advance as possible. So they're going, I need 5 minutes in and out. That is also a mistake because one, if anything goes wrong, you're going to be late and that's stressful. But two, because it doesn't give you enough time to actually wake up, which means you won't necessarily be functioning at your best on test day, which is the whole point. So give yourself enough time to wake up your body and your brain before you go into test day. This is so important. So something like walking, stretching, maybe a little bit of yoga, maybe a hot or a cold shower, whatever wakes you up and makes you feel alert, do that. I see a lot of students go to the test center in pajamas. I do not recommend that. It doesn't put you in the right space to take a test. So wear something that you would wear on a normal day of school, like a casual Friday sort of vibe. So if you normally wear jeans to school, wear jeans. If you normally wear sweatpants to school, wear sweatpants, but just normal, comfortable, but in public for you. I've also seen students wear full suits to exam day. Don't do that either because that's not going to be comfortable unless that's your normal school attire. So go dressed to like you're going to school to learn. So walk, stretch, wake up. And then we're going to read something lightly academic. So a lot of folks think they should do maybe practice problems the morning of. I don't typically recommend that, but I do recommend reading something like maybe a news article or something from a school book, something that is going to mirror what you would see on the test. So not super academic, but not super casual. But the big point is just waking up your brain and reminding your brain like how to read. This is especially important on the SAT, which starts with the reading section. A lot of students start the reading section and their brains haven't fully booted up yet. And so the first passage ends up going slow and they end up making mistakes. And then they end up in the hole from the first passage. And that just puts you in a bad situation for the rest of the test. One, because it's hard to recover from, but two, even if you do, it can just put you in kind of a funk and cause you to not perform at your best. So just making sure that you are physically and mentally prepared to take that test is going to help you just hit the ground running from the first problem. Eat a normal breakfast. I hear a lot, eat a big breakfast. I don't recommend that because if you're someone who gets sick from a big breakfast, you shouldn't be eating a big breakfast. You can take snacks. So eat something that you would eat on, again, a good day of school, right? Where you have time to eat, you have something that you enjoy and that makes you feel good. Try to balance fats, proteins, carbs, something that's going to hit all of those bases, and then bring a snack like trail mix, again, fats, proteins, and carbs, something that's going to sustain you and make you feel great. When it comes to caffeine, if you're someone who has caffeine regularly, do it. But if you're not someone who has caffeine regularly, don't chug a Red Bull. Don't do a 5-hour energy. It's not worth it. It can just put you in a weird space. Again, if you've been taking your practice tests, do it like you would take your practice test. If you're not going to chug a 5-hour energy for your practice test, don't do it for test day. It should be something you've done before. All right. And then breathe mindfully. We just really want to be cognizant of managing how we're feeling the morning of the test so that we're feeling our best going into it. Mindfulness strategies like counting your breaths or counting while you're breathing can be really useful. Strategies like I forget exactly what it is, but like the number of things you can see, the number of things you can hear, number of things you can smell, number of things you can touch, that can be really useful. But similarly, those visualizing success strategies can be really, really helpful here as well for dealing with unproductive thoughts. And whatever personally works for you. So when I've taken a big test or had like a big presentation, I go for a walk because that makes me feel better. Some people will do yoga. Some people will go for a short run, but something that's going to help you feel mindful and feel your best. Okay, so that's the morning of routine. So let's talk final takeaways. No matter what your timeline is, you're going to want to have a consistent practice test schedule. Practice tests are the skeleton, the structure of a good study schedule. They're going to inform what you should be doing, and they're going to give you the practice that you're going to really lean on your test day. So whatever happens on your practice test is what's going to happen on test day. So if you are multiple months out or a single month out, you're going to plan for every 2 to 4 weeks with your final test about a week out. If you have 1 week left, take your practice test now. Now, based on those practice tests, we are going to really go in and review our mistakes, and we're going to use that to develop a personalized study plan based on our weaknesses and eventually a personalized study guide. This is going to be informed by that in-depth practice test review, so it should be extremely personal to your student. And then we're going to have a low-key last week where we have a plan for the night before and morning of so that just goes really naturally and smoothly, but in particular where we prioritize strategy over content. Again, basing that off our practice tests, basing that off the study based on our practice tests, but something that is going to impact us based on how we personally perform. And that's it. So if anyone has questions on what we talked about in this webinar, if you have questions about Magoosh, if you have questions outside of what we talked about in this webinar, I'm happy to answer those now. Another plug again for this 10% off any ACT or SAT plan coupon, webinar 06/06/21, that's today's date. And again, that will work for our online programs as well as for our live classes, some of which are starting tomorrow, some of which are starting Tuesday. Okay, so there are a couple of questions that are already in here So Jessica, good if I go ahead and jump in with some of those?
Yeah, I'm seeing a few that are related. So
Oh, great.
there's a question, where can you find practice ACT exams? And then also, where would I be able to get some good SAT practice tests if I already took all the College Board ones
Ah.
already?
Okay, great question. So I'll start with ACT. There are, I think, like 6 official ACT exams that are available as PDFs online. If you just Google official ACT practice tests, there are plenty of compiled lists by test prep companies. Magoosh, other test prep companies list those out with links to those PDFs. There's one that is preparing for the ACT that's pretty publicized on the ACT website, but the other ones maybe take a little bit of digging. I would just note that as you go further back, some of those are going to be less realistic, like particularly the essay is totally different, but that is the least important section, and the rest is going to be pretty consistent going back like to 2005. So that is what I would recommend for ACT is to use those. And then beyond that, I have a video on this on our YouTube channel if you want to check that out. But the gist of it is beyond official tests, you're going to really want to do your due diligence to make sure that those tests are realistic. And you're just going to want to take it with a grain of salt. Practice tests from different companies. Some skew easy, some skew hard. Some are just not realistic at all. One that I'll put a plug for is we have a paper practice test for ACT that you can find on our blog. If you just search Magoosh ACT practice test PDF, you should be able to find it. And that's a good one that I use in our live classes all the time. So those would be the ones I would recommend. There are some other free ones. If you want like a more solid base of them, I would recommend potentially a paid option is going to provide more. So for instance, our Magoosh online ACT program has the option of making up to 4 practice tests, just customized from what is left over in our pool of practice test questions. So those can also be an option. So that's ACT. SAT, if your student has already taken all of the College Board exams, the first thing that I would say is it sounds like your student is maybe taking too many practice tests. So I would first just kind of reassess how your student is using those practice tests. If you're using the practice tests as material outside of practice tests, I would stop doing that because you are running out of practice tests. So my number one recommendation would be just really make sure that you have used all of them. Check out Khan Academy, check out College Board, make sure you actually have gone through all of them. There are 2 that have been taken off of the College Board website, maybe for like slight inaccuracies, but they're still really good. Those are SAT practice test 2 and 4. Those are ones that I've used a lot with my students. Your child might not have seen those yet. So those are 2 that I would look up. Those PDFs are still floating around. So I would just search SAT practice test 2 PDF and SAT practice test 4 PDF. Find those. Magoosh also has a paper practice test for SAT that is free, that again, you can find on our blog or just by Googling it, Magoosh SAT practice test PDF. And again, there are some other free options from other test prep companies. Again, grain of salt. I would maybe do some research on whether the scores tend to come out low or high. There tends to be just kind of a different reputation that different companies' tests have, just so that you know and don't end up with a false expectation, but it can still be really good practice. And then again, I might lean towards some paid offerings. So again, Magoosh for practice tests just opens up some more options for your student. But yeah, I would maybe be leaning toward, depending on your study timeline, more like every 4 weeks, just so that you can make those practice tests stretch. Hopefully that answers the question.
So Erika, you mentioned Khan Academy as a resource,
did, yeah.
and we have a question. How would you rate Khan Academy SAT reading and writing practice on a scale of 10?
Oh boy. I don't know if I can commit to a number, but I do like Khan Academy. I think that as a free resource, it's really, really awesome. So one thing that's great about Khan Academy is that it's free. Another thing about Khan Academy, it's pretty video based. If your student learns well from videos, I would recommend that. The other thing about Khan Academy is that they do have a partnership with College Board, which means that they do have access to some pretty good materials. The other thing that I would note that's cool about Khan Academy is if your student already has a test score, that you can upload that to Khan Academy and they can give you customized practice for reading and writing. So I would say if you're looking for a free option, that can be really, really awesome. There's a couple of things about it that aren't perfect. It's not going to be super customized to you. That's one thing. What's another thing there? It's not going to have really like a live or interactive component, if that's something that you're looking for. And probably if you're looking for like a ton of support, you're maybe not going to get that there as well. But as a free resource, it is great. So I would recommend using that to supplement your prep for sure.
Great. I'm seeing a couple questions around length of study per day, so I'm going to bundle them a little bit. So there's one question, how long should we study for every day? And there's another one, my son has his ACT in a month. Would an hour a day until then be enough time to study?
Great. That's an awesome question. So kind of to deal with the first one, how much time per day? So it might depend a little on the day. So for instance, you can get something out of 20 minutes of study, but that 20 minutes of study is likely going to be like reviewing your strategy guide or doing something like reviewing mistakes from a previous day. You're probably not going to learn a lot and then be able to apply a lot in 20 minutes. So you're probably going to want to have a couple of longer study sessions as well. That said, you don't want them to be too long because I find that a lot of students are trying to cram in a bunch of study on the weekend, and then they end up studying for such a long time that the quality drops off, and then we start making mistakes we shouldn't and start making the same mistakes, and then the bad habits build. So I typically recommend one, just having some honesty with yourself there and letting your student make the decision if they are not performing the way they should be to step back, to walk away, and maybe come back to it later. Just being honest with yourself and recognizing when you're not performing can help. We don't want to push through something that's going to hurt us. In terms of like an actual time, let me give you an answer. I find that an hour is a really great amount of time. 2 hours can also be really good. I typically don't tend to push much beyond that unless we're doing a practice test. So a practice test is going to be like 4 hours. It's a lot of time, but then I say walk away, score it, walk away, and then come back and then do your review maybe over a couple of days. So to go to the other question then, will an hour a day be enough? I think an hour a day is a great amount of study. As like a length of time to study. I would definitely say that you should, again, plan for those practice tests and then plan for that review. So practice tests will be longer, review sessions will likely be longer. So that's probably happening every 2 to 4 weeks. That said, enough is kind of tricky because enough is going to depend on your students' goals. So would I recommend going much higher than that? I don't know if I would. You could potentially bump up to 2-hour sessions, but then I would start saying like, you got to take a day off. I recommend a day off in general. Typically a good number of hours per week is 10. That's the one that I typically recommend to most students. You can go a little bit lower and still get mileage out of it, but I wouldn't go any lower than 5. You can maybe go up to 15. I would say if you've got nothing else going on, it's summer, you could go up to 20 hours a week, but like that's max out because at that point, you're probably going to start running into just poor study. So I would say take a look at your students' score goals. And then if you wanted to take a look at our last webinar, I give some guidance on, how long of a study timeline you're looking at if you're doing 10 hours a week and what that score improvement should look like for that amount of time. And if you're finding that that doesn't align, you might want to bump up the number of hours a little bit, or you might want to reconsider your study timeline. Hopefully that addresses your question.
Great. So here's a question around rising seniors. So if you're a rising senior, when is considered too late to take the ACT or SAT?
Great question. It's gonna totally depend on when your applications are going in. So in terms of what I recommend personally, if you can get it done before your senior year, that's awesome. Just because your senior year there's a lot going on. You're getting your applications in, you are doing senior year, which is often the most rigorous year. There's a lot going on. So I recommend if you can just get it done before senior year or in the first chunk of senior year. But again, what is too late? That's going to depend on when your applications are due. So some students are able to push it pretty close to the wire. My recommendation would be if your student hasn't taken a test to try to take one maybe this summer or like very early in senior year, September, October. And then if at that point we're going like, okay, maybe I want to do a retake, you could go a little bit closer to some deadlines. But I definitely would not recommend a one and only on your last possible test date. Hopefully that makes sense.
All right, kind of on the other spectrum, I have 2 years to prepare for the SAT. When do you think a good time is to start joining places such as Magoosh?
Great question. 2 years is amazing. I love that you're thinking about this early. What would I recommend? Let me think about this to make sure that my advice is good. If you wanted to do something now, the thing that I would recommend is take a practice test for the SAT, wait a couple of weeks, take a practice test for the ACT, and then see which one you perform better on. And then just commit. That's the one. Great. And that's going to be the one that you can focus on. Again, confirming that that one's going to work for all of the schools, all of the scholarships, all that good stuff. But the second thing that you can do with that is go, okay, let me look at my score that I have right now. That's my baseline. Then I'm going to look at where I'm going, right? What is the score that I want for maybe schools that I'm looking at, if you thought that far ahead, which if so, incredible. I had not when I was 2 years out. So kind of looking at, okay, what am I aiming for? And then what's that difference that I want to make up? And that can inform what you want your study timeline to be. Again, you can check out the last webinar we did. That's on YouTube. I give some guidelines for what sort of timeline you should have for what kind of score improvement. And if you're looking at a smaller score improvement, I'd recommend maybe not worrying about it. I would again recommend trying to get it done junior year or summer before senior year so you don't have to worry about it. If you're looking at a larger score improvement, you might want to start thinking about that a little bit earlier, maybe a year out. So maybe a good time to start would be like summer before your junior year. That would be a great time to do like a course or to like dig into a book over your summer break and really just kind of like build that foundation. Take a practice test or two, maybe like one a month, start building that up. And then again, just like reestablish your baseline to figure out, am I much closer? Do I still have a ways to go? And then let that inform that last year. So if you want to do something now, to recap, practice test to see where you are. And then depending on that timeline, I would recommend potentially starting as early as summer before junior year. Hopefully that helps.
Great. Erika, you mentioned some books, something about books. And there's a question, are there any good strategy books for the ACT?
Strategy books. Let me think. You can do the official guide. The official guide is great. It's going to be chock full of practice tests. That's another great place for practice tests. I can't believe I didn't even say that before. Official guide for ACT, practice tests. It's also going to have a ton of questions in there. In terms of strategy, there's going to be some. It's going to be kind of more like entry-level strategy on like how to approach questions, how to approach timing, how to approach passages, things like that. In terms of like strategy, I would probably recommend online prep, and part of that's biased because I've been in the online prep world for a while, but online prep is going to be easier to sift through in terms of like targeting something that's going to be right for you. If your student doesn't learn great from text, there's also going to be video options online. So those are some things to consider there. And that's also going to open up more opportunities for something that's more strategy focused. So if you're looking for like the most realistic official material out there, I would recommend OG. If you're looking for strategy stuff, I would look at maybe something from a test prep company and consider going online, especially if your student learns better from video.
Great. Okay, we have a couple specific questions around points and scores. My son prepared for the SAT. Verbal score was 610. There's no specific question type that he has difficulty with, no time management problem. They're aiming for a 750 plus. Any ideas what the problem is?
Yeah, good question. So my first thing that I would ask is, how does that break down between reading and writing? Because that score out of 800 is composed of a score for writing out of 40 and a score for reading out of 40, that balance is going to inform what your child should be working on. So that's the first thing that I would say is figure out which one is going to be more challenging for your student and what's going to be worth more time. The second thing that I would mention is that you said that there maybe isn't a specific question type that they're struggling with. There's no real like trends there. I would maybe say that there might be a trend there, but you're maybe just not seeing it. And so what I would recommend, maybe they're falling for like a consistent answer trap, or maybe it is a similar question type, but it doesn't look like the same question type or something like that, right? Or maybe there's just a strategy that isn't going right for grammar or something. Or there's a passage type that's tricky for reading. In any case, I would recommend an error log is probably the thing that I would recommend. And this is actually something that I would recommend to any student for their review of their practice test or their study. And what that is going in and for every single question that your child is missing, going, what did I do wrong? Okay, so like, did I, for writing, did I just not see something? Did I answer too quickly without looking at the other answer choices? Did I pick an answer that was too extreme? What did I do wrong? Then going, okay, why did I do that? So that might be, I just didn't have enough time, or it might be, I got so excited about seeing this one thing that I jumped into it without finishing reading the answer choice. Or it might be, I remembered something from this other paragraph, but it wasn't the paragraph this question was asking about. Okay. Or so on and so forth. Or I just didn't notice this word, or there's a lot of reasons. So dig into why, make it really, really personal, right? Dig deep, take time with this. And then go, okay, this is the hardest one. How do I recognize this later and how do I fix it? So that might be something, that might be where we start uncovering maybe some of the trends. So maybe I need to look for words that are extreme, words that have a lot of tone in them in the answer choices. Or maybe it's something like, I need to make a prediction before I look at the answer choices because these are tricking me, or maybe it's, I'm not summarizing what paragraphs are doing as I'm reading the passage. And so then I don't know when I get to the answer choices, just because I was focusing too much on the trees and not enough on the forest. Or, I need to, when I see a colon, I need to remember that the rule is that there needs to be an independent clause beforehand. And this process takes a while, right? This is an in-depth process. So it probably means that your child is going to spend less time doing questions, but they're going to get a lot more out of it. And then I recommend reviewing that error log every time they sit down to practice before they practice. Then going, okay, I am prioritizing not making that same mistake again. So even if there isn't a huge trend, we can address each of those individual issues by just really going, each one of these is an issue. It's not a nebulous thing. I'm just struggling. It is these 10 things, and then trying to deal with them each individually. Hope that helps. Error logs are powerful.
Thank you, Erica. Question, do you think it's possible to get a 1500 or higher on your first SAT exam? Also, where can I find additional practice tests? Maybe we can skip that one since we've talked a lot about
yeah. It is possible. It happens. It is possible. One thing that I would note is that there are scores in the high 1400s that are like very high, like high 90th percentile, like not going to keep you out of any university type scores. So I find that a lot of students who I've been working with who are scoring in the 1500s on test day, they just get unlucky. They get one of those tests where everyone's scoring high and missing one question knocks them down, and they end up with like a 1470. It happens. So once you're at kind of that top zone, it can be a little touch and go. So what actually happens on test day can depend on test day, and one thing can really change the game. So it is possible. The thing that I would recommend is a practice test and trying to take it realistically and going, what am I actually seeing right now? And is it realistic for me personally to expect that on test day? Because is that how I'm performing? And then even then, again, it's not 100% with a score that high.
Great. All right. So question about test optional. Since most universities have opted to be test optional for 2022 intake, do you recommend taking the SAT or ACT at all?
Great question. Yes, is the short answer. The longer answer is one, not every school is test optional, right? There are schools that are still requiring the SAT and the ACT, and there are scholarships that are still requiring the SAT and ACT, and there are programs that are requiring the SAT and ACT. So not taking it just limits your options in a pretty significant way. It's worthwhile to have that in your back pocket in case even if you don't have that school list right now or don't have the list of scholarships, just having it available to you is something that I really recommend. Point two is that test optional and test blind are not the same thing. So if a university is test blind, it means they do not look at scores. If you send it in, they do not care. It will not go into your admissions. Okay. In that case, if you're applying to exclusively test blind stuff, you do not need the score. It will not help you. But at test optional schools, they still look, right? All it's saying is you don't have to have it, but they still look. So if you send in your scores and you shine in math and you're applying for a math program, that helps, right? Or if you're performing particularly well in the reading section, that's a really strong indicator of freshman retention rate, and they know that, right? So they're still going to look at that, and that can be something that is still a very compelling piece of your application. So my recommendation is still to prioritize it. It is still an important piece of the application, and it just gives you another chance to show off.
All right. So we have a question, ACT or SAT? I'm going to take this as, is one better than the other? How do I decide?
Yeah. So first thing, make sure all your schools take both. If any of your schools just take one, or any of your scholarships just take one, or programs or whatever, just confirm, make sure, because if there's one that you need to take, you need to take it. Part two of that is it's going to depend on you. Most schools that take both just don't care which one it is. What they do care about is your percentile, how you're performing. So if you are scoring higher percentile wise on one test than on the other, that is the one you should prioritize. So I was getting at that with the answer to another question, which is what's a really good thing to do if you have some time, or maybe if you're trying to choose what test to focus on, is to take a practice test for one, wait a little bit of time, take a practice test for the other, and then compare your scores, and not your raw scores, not your scaled scores, but your percentiles. So how you're performing relative to other test takers. And then the one that you have a higher percentile on, that's the one. Take that one. And then if you're performing similarly on either one, just pick the one that you felt better doing or the one where you went, oh, I should have done that, where you looked at your mistakes and you got why you made the mistakes better. So that's going to be more of a judgment call. So it's just going to be personal. A couple of things to know: SAT math makes up 50% of the total score. ACT math makes up like a fourth of the total score. So that's a thing that might inform how you perform on either one. ACT has science. Science is like reading, but with more technical stuff and more graphs and charts. That can be a weak section for a lot of people, especially if it's not familiar, which it's not super familiar to a lot of people, and it can really be troubling with time management. But again, you're probably not going to know until you try it. So my best recommendation is try either one and then compare.
Right, we have a few more questions around test optional. This one is, if colleges or universities say that SAT and ACT scores are optional, does that mean I can still apply if I don't have the required score for them, and will I still be accepted?
Interesting. Okay. So if they are optional, you still can totally apply. You can also still totally apply if you don't meet like their guidelines. You can still go for it. Yes, you can still totally apply. Will you be accepted? I don't know. So one thing that I would note here, I'm not entirely sure when you say score requirement, I'm not entirely sure what that means. Do you mean like average score? Do you mean like minimum score? If you're talking average score there are still 50% of students who get in with an average or below score. So I would just note that you could be one of them. Similarly, I would note that there are other elements of your application that schools consider. It's not just test scores, especially if that school is test optional. You have other opportunities to shine. You've got your GPA, you've got your course rigor, you've got your extracurriculars, you've got your admissions essays, you've got your letters of recommendation, you got a lot of stuff going into that application. So my recommendation, again, scores do play a role. You could lean into the fact that it is test optional and not send them if you know that they're not going to be scores that school is impressed with, and just lean into the other elements of your application. But if your score is average or above, it probably is only going to do you favors. Hopefully that helps.
All right. Are colleges and universities going to be test optional or test blind for the class of 2023?
Short answer, I don't know. Things are changing rapidly in the world of admissions and the world of test prep. There are some schools who have committed to multiple years or forever being test blind or test optional. It seems like a trend, and this is, again, not my area of expertise. My area of expertise is the test, not the admissions. But it does seem like a growing trend. I would imagine that it's probably similar going into 2023 as it is going into 2022 and 2021. But I really can't say for sure. I would recommend looking at your specific schools and seeing if they've committed to anything. But I would note that things change, and taking the test is a safe bet.
All right, one more question around super scores. So when my daughter applied to colleges, they took super scores on SAT. Do they still do that?
Great question. It depends on the school. So different schools do super score, different schools don't. So some schools will look at your highest score ever. Some schools will look at your most recent score, and then some schools will super score. So whether or not you like actually have your test super scored doesn't really matter. If the school super scores, they'll do it on their own anyway. But again, it's going to totally depend on the school. I would recommend researching for that specific school. Most likely, if they did it in the past, that same school will do it again, but it does vary across schools. So one thing that I would note is if you are retaking, because it does vary, make sure that you're not letting your strong sections slip. I know that happened to me on my SAT, where I took the test once, got a score, took it again, and they just went blank. So the weaker areas went up and my stronger areas went down. It didn't really matter. It was a good score anyway, but it was just kind of a funny thing that happened. So would recommend just being careful and planning for schools that don't super score. So try to make your last test score your highest.
All right. I think this is our last question, and it's kind of a fun one. Do you have a preference on which one to take, the ACT or the SAT?
Oh, great question. So when I took the tests, I got 99 percentile scores on both of them. So I performed about the same on either one. That said, they were a little bit different when I took it, particularly SAT. If I were to take the test today and I wanted to get the best possible score, I would take the SAT, I think. Again, personally, 100% personally. And the reason for that is that I know that test maybe a little bit better personally. I've just spent more time with it. I find that the ACT can do weirder stuff than the SAT does. They bring in some question types that are just kind of off the wall, whereas the SAT is very consistent, I find, with just what they bring with each section. And then when I was in high school, I found the science timing really challenging. It's not really a thing for me anymore, but if something were to mess me up on test day, it would probably be that. So I would probably go with SAT personally, just because that is where I feel stronger. But again, that's based on me. So I would say base it on you and how you or your child performs on the exam, because it really does depend on the person.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining. Thank you so much, Erika, for answering all these wonderful questions. And if you do have more questions, we do have a Facebook group where we have Erika and other test prep experts pop in from time to time. And if you have questions, you can leave them there. And I'll also be following up with the link to the recording of this webinar. And then just one last pitch, we do have a bunch of cohorts of live classes starting tomorrow and Tuesday. So if you or your child are taking the test over the summer or coming up in August, take a look at those. They are kind of more guided, and as you can tell, our test prep experts are wonderful. So you'll be able to work with them. All right, we're gonna sign off, but thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.